Hello, BookTube. Recently on his channel, Shawn the Book Maniac did another iteration of his famous page 112 tag, and that was all the prompting I needed to do one on this channel. I love the page 112 tag for a number of reasons. Those of you who maybe haven't seen his video, you should subscribe to his channel. I'll leave a link to his video down below. He came across years ago the existence of a French literary prize where the judges judge the books that will go on their long list of choices by page 112 of the text. No author, no title, no publicity material of any kind, and especially not the heavily vetted opening chapters of the works themselves. Instead, jump forward and read page 112 without context and without any kind of falderall, and judge whether or not you want to see the rest of the book and therefore put it on a long list by what that page does to you. Admittedly, this kind of an exercise is a tad unfair, right? I mean, the assumption is, the assumption is that most books are so heavily vetted in their early chapters that it's not until page 112 or thereabouts, some random area there, that you're going to see the author doing what they do. But before that, it's going to be the author plus a bunch of other people. The unfairness comes in that books build good. We're talking works of fiction here, obviously, although I've done page 112 with nonfiction and loved it, and I will do it again. We should be doing it regularly. It's a wonderful thing to do. But novels, works of fiction, do build, and therefore jumping straight into a random page, 100 pages in, can be a little unfair to judging their worth. But that's part of the reason why I love the page 112 tag, is because in order to counteract that unfairness, you really have to distance yourself from the work. You have to take a big step back and actually look at it analytically on the page. You have to see what it's doing on the page. And I love that naturally because in my job as a book critic, ideally, if you're doing the job correctly, you are doing that with every book. You're reading it fine. You can read it with your guts and your heart and your lymph nodes and whatnot. But when you go back and read it critically, in order to work up a review, that's exactly what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to take a big step back and look at what's actually happening and weigh it against your experience of all the similar times that same thing has happened, in your reading history. It's a kind of a failure on a review's part if you don't do that. If you get to all the way to your written review, and you're still saying, well, I felt this, I felt that, well, I had this emotional reaction, I had that emotional reaction. That's kind of a failure, because your reviewer doesn't know, your reader doesn't know you. So that information does them precious little good. But when I saw Shawn's latest version of the tag, I thought I will do the same thing. Now, there are all sorts of ways to do this. Ideally, the ideal representation of the original page 112 thing that Shawn noticed would be if you didn't know anything about the books when you got the excerpts. And occasionally in the past of the page 112 tag, people have done that. They have taken the trouble to write out excerpts and then sent them to another booktuber with the identifying information in a separate email, so that you can just open the first email and do the tag completely blind and then find out what the books are. I've done that, and it's a lot of fun, but usually it takes the form that it just took for Shawn, which is as close as you can come without that bother, which is to take books off your shelf that you haven't read yet. So you know what they are, title-wise, author-wise, but you don't know anything else than that, and you hold that back from your viewers on your video and just give them the text. So that's what we're going to do today, and I'm going to stick to fiction. I've got 3 works of fiction here that I have not read. So we're going to go through page 112 of each one, and we'll rank them, we'll talk about them, and then I'll tell you what they are. So here is the first, page 112. We pull into a parking space next to the wall of a Days Inn, and she turns off the light and ignition. The aluminum numerals on the red metal door read 214. Let's go in, I say. I open my door. She turns her face away from me and stares at something across the parking lot. She's very quiet, unhappy, almost angry. What are you looking at? I say. I see the back of her dark head move. Nothing. She pulls the keys out and opens the door. Let's go on in. Now that you've got me out here, we might as well. I haven't twisted her arm to get her out here. She's driven us over here willingly. Now I don't know what's wrong with her. She gets out and comes around to the front door, or to the front of the car, looking down, not looking at me. I slip the key in and unlock the door. I turn on the light. A motel room like any other. I set what's left of the fifth on the plastic wood grain table and go back and lean against the door. She is standing below the sidewalk, hugging herself with her arms, facing away. She seems to be looking at a blue Chevy pickup parked across the lot. You coming in? I say. Without answering, she turns and comes by me and goes to sit on the bed. I shut the door and bolt it. I'm a little drunk. She'd better be careful. I take the bottle out of the sack and open it, tilting a burning drink down my throat. I hold it out to her. You want a drink? She shakes her head violently and stares at the floor. Well, I say. I look around and see the TV. You want to watch some TV? It doesn't matter, she said. Nothing matters. Boy, ain't we just having loads of fun, I say. Okay, so that is our first page 112. And it's bald. It's straightforward. It's as prose, there's virtually no fuss or description of any kind. And it's a little on the dark or dangerous side. There are ominous notes. The narrator saying that the woman had better be careful because he's a little drunk is a little on the ominous side. There's a bleakness to it. But it is kind of involving. The thing about unadorned, just dot, 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 dot prose like that is that it's built to make you want to keep reading. And I do want to keep reading. I'll be interested to know your reactions to all of these things, but I do want to keep reading when I read that. I'm not sure that I like it, that I like the scenario, and I don't often have a great deal of affection for fiction writing that abandons so many of fiction writing's, what I view as fiction writing's duties. So a passage like that reads like a police report, the writer is going to have to walk carefully or I'm going to very drastically lose interest. But I didn't lose interest in that passage. So now we'll move on to the next one. This is page 112 of our next book. And once again, in these, as in all my earlier page 112 tag iterations, I'm not sticking straight to the page. I'm reading, a moment, a beat, a dramatic beat. So I'm not going to start a page in mid-sentence. I'm not going to end one in mid-sentence. So just so we're clear about that. So here is the next one. Life nearly always puts up a struggle. The strangling of a single creature, even as one as small as a partridge, can be surprisingly difficult. Joab's task was the slow strangulation of a city. He and his men had to cut off the supply of all that was necessary for life within the walls of Rabbath Ammon. The hold could not be relaxed for an instant, since the composite creature that the city was had teeth and fury to inflict great hurt. Death came so very slowly at first. Nothing but time and a sustained offensive could accomplish it. Sheer duration. There was something stupid about it. Keeping on and on and on. Stupid, tiring, unimaginative, cruel. No strategy to think through, only pacing, persistence, and a concern for the welfare of his men. Throughout this process, the Ark was present. Though it neither spoke nor moved of its own accord, it was for some of its soldiers gathered there the true authority. Its presence reassured them. By its presence alone, it prayed for them, guarded them, and sanctified them. Joab knew that it was his duty to keep the ark safe, and that in its safety lay the safety of Israel. But he was wary of it. He was not a naturally religious man. He had no instinct for religion, and if he prayed in public. His prayer was the act of a general who appreciated the need for a unifying concept, an authority beyond himself and beyond even the king. He protected the ark by appointing guardians. He did not want to go near it himself, lest it burn him. He knew, they all did, what had happened to Uzzah when he had put out his hand to steady the ark. Joab knew Uzzah had died on the spot, but he did not begin to understand why. Would he not have done the same if something he had undertaken to protect was in danger? It was human instinct to reach out and prevent the precious cargo from falling. Supposing the ark had fallen, what then? Should the men escorting it have picked it up and risked being struck down like Uzzah, or should they have just left it there, where it fell, for Yahweh to sort it out? There was a line where priestly reverence deviated from the natural respect, and once this line had been crossed, Joab was in an unknown, incomprehensible land. He also knew that the men of Beth Shemesh had been massacred for looking into the ark, 50,070 of them, all dead, because they were curious about this marvelous thing that had rolled into view, pulled into the field by the two pale cows who led it to them, seemingly of their own accord, for no driver was ever seen. Okay, we have a very different reading experience there, very different. And obviously, though, you don't have to know much about history or literature to realize where you are in that segment. That is a segment describing a piece of the Old Testament, a piece of Old Testament narrative. The Ark is the Ark of the Covenant. Job is a general who is besieging a city, and the details that are given about the men who tried to steady the Ark, a man who tries to steady the Ark and is struck dead, or 50,000 men who are struck dead for looking inside it, those details will be known if you've read the Old Testament. The Ark of the Covenant shows up often in the Old Testament, and it is a lethal thing. It is not alive, but it is a classic illustration of the unpredictability of the Old Testament God, who can give presents and blessings that are decidedly double-edged and can be lethal to the very people they're meant to be helping. The passage, I thought, was really good, really textured, really involving, and very intelligently written. There was a tiny bit of a problem in the passage that we read, the passage that we read, in that the focus shifts from the process, the dumb, mechanical, animal strangling of a city in a siege, which is how we start out, and that is a very accurate description of what a siege is like. Once you've laid a siege correctly, once the broad mechanics of it are all in place, all you have to do is just be cruel. All you have to do is just continually, gradually tighten, while keeping your own men well-fed, well-watered, free of disease, and also out of range of the increasing desperation of the city you're besieging. That is all you have to do. There is no inventiveness involved at all. And that's true. It's a very good description. But it moves, right? The segment that we're reading changes from that emphasis to the Ark. The narrative moves on in the place that we're going to a different subject. So this is another weakness of page 112, is that we're not going to know if that's a defect until you read more. You can't tell from just the one page that you're reading. It could be that the author might have complete control of their material. And the digression about the Ark is just that, a digression. And maybe in 2 paragraphs or even 10 paragraphs, you're going to come back to the siege segment of the narrative and be none the worse for it. That could easily be true. Or it could also be that kind of shifting from one subject to another in an otherwise fluid narrative is a characteristic of the whole book. Maybe it's a characteristic of whoever is narrating the story. You won't know that from just one page. And you can tell from that excerpt that you're reading whether or not you like what you read. But seen from my own point of view as a reviewer, it would be absolutely worthless. Judges, fine, okay. For a literary prize, okay, fine. But you couldn't possibly review a book or even come to a conclusion of any kind about the book based just on that. And then we'll do our last, page 112. These are all fiction, and we'll do our last page 112, and then we will talk about it. So here's the last one. I wasn't close to these relatives, seeing them just once or twice a year. My cousin, a year my senior, had brought along his fiancée, whom he'd met in medical school at Johns Hopkins. Thomas was puppyishly exuberant in greetings, hiked and biked on weekends in Maryland, ensconced himself in performance fleece, responded to most comments with awesome, or a variant thereof. The woman he was engaged to was a distaff version of him. Both seemed incapable of self-doubt or self-loathing. They hadn't yet set a date, but I dreaded whenever it would be. At dinner, Thomas recounted almost day by day the 2 weeks he'd recently spent in Kenya through a medical aid program tending to villagers who lacked basic health care, and flaunted a picture of a little boy hugging him. Then he discussed his and his fiancée's upcoming vacation to Australia over Christmas. How about you, he asked, after he'd indefatigably monologued for a quarter of an hour. Are you writing a novel? Short stories. Nice. What are they about? They're usually about 10 to 20 pages long, I said, my usual stock deflection. No one laughed. I don't like to bore people with descriptions of them. They're really good, said Billy. Man, I wish I had time to write. I have 1 million stories from Kenya alone, Thomas said. Scratch that. I wish I had time to read. The next day, I took Billy into Cambridge. Sorry about my cousin, I said over coffee in in Cafe Pamplona. I know he's a little much. Billy said, he's all right. You can say it. I find him really annoying. I don't know, he said. I'm just always amazed people will fly halfway around the world to take care of some Africans when there are plenty of African Americans 10 minutes away in Baltimore who could use his help. Okay, but the Kenyans seem to need help even more, I said. You could argue that it makes sense for you from a utilitarian standpoint. Then he could donate the money he spent on his plane ticket directly to the Kenyans. Or if he's going to go there, do less glamorous work of helping set up a clinic so they can take care of themselves, instead of needing Americans like him to come in and rescue them. His mouth twisted scornfully. Even if he has the best of intentions, he wants to be the one to get credit for helping them. He wants a cute picture as a trophy, and it all becomes another fun trip for him to tell about. Same as going to Australia. Okay, so we have a little bit of social commentary. We've had none of that so far. This is a different world from either of the two worlds that we've seen. This is not two people who obviously barely know each other checking into a motel, obviously for reasons of sex. And this is not textured historical fiction. This is very contemporary fiction, if I may invoke a term that I've recently bashed. Again, I think very engaging, very, very direct. But we don't get a whole lot of the discussion of the cousin, the insufferable cousin who went to Kenya. We don't get much of that. We don't hear or see much of him before we go straight to his condemnation by other characters. So that's interesting. It raises a little red flag in my mind, maybe who's trustworthy here and who's dealing with sour grapes. But again, there's not enough to know. So those are our 3-page 112 tags. And for my money, I like number 2 the most. Biblical fiction. Of course, I would. When you're doing a page 112, you can't do much in the way of criticism. I think all 3 of these excerpts are well done. From just the standpoint of prose, I think they're all well done. So I can't choose against any one of them based on that. So I really am going with just what I would prefer, the register that I would prefer to keep reading, and that would be the biblical fiction of number 2. And then something about the sharpness of number 3 would probably make it my next choice. And then the third would be number 1, the motel scene. And I'm wondering what you thought of all of those. And now I want to tell you about each of these things, because I don't think we've seen any of them on this channel. They are all fiction. They are all forthcoming fiction. And the first one comes out in late November. And this is Tiny Love. This is the complete stories of Larry Brown, a Dude Bro author who is sine qua non among Dude Bro authors. He is beloved among Dude Bro champions. And I've always kind of sort of liked him more than I usually like Dude Bro authors. There always seems to me to be a slightly greater degree of human emotion. One of the things that I hate about Dude Bro authors is that they put up these characters and they act like they are the final, last, dirty stool on a battered bar counter arbiters of human nature, when in fact the characters that they're putting up have been denuded of all human nature. The characters aren't human in any way whatsoever, not even as automatons. They're just weird mouthpieces for Dude Bro nihilism. And I never usually get that impression with Larry Brown. I'd be willing to bet that the story that we read an excerpt from there, I'd be willing to bet that story expands to make real characters of at least the narrator, if not both, figures in the story. But this is coming out in November, and this is a whole bunch of Larry Brown short stories extending over decades. So it'll be a big event. It will get reviewed everywhere, just everywhere. But even though it gets reviewed everywhere, because there's nothing that professional book reviewers like to do more than heap praise on Dude Bro Lit. It checks all their boxes. It rings all their bells in ways that I think have all sorts of easily discernible explanations. It's not to anybody's credit, but I think this will probably get reviewed in a lot of places. But I'd be willing to bet that it doesn't get as widely reviewed as number 2, as the source for our biblical fiction. I think is going to get reviewed universally. And this is Elizabeth Cook. This is a book called Lux, L-U-X, a fairly large novel that is extremely ambitious. It is it sets up a dialogue between historical eras in its historical fiction. Let me tell you about it here. Let's see here. King David sings his psalms. That is, King David is obviously the king that's mentioned in the excerpt that we read. A world away, King Henry plots, and courtier Thomas Wyatt sees them both. His beloved falcon looks on his arm. Lukkes. Also sounds like the word for light. David wants Bathsheba. Henry, too, must have what he wants. He wants Anne, a divorce, a son. So in other words, it's Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Henry looks up at his tapestry of David and sees a mighty predecessor who defended his faith and took what he liked and leaves it to others to count the cost. Among those counting the cost is the poet Wyatt, who sees a different David, a man who repented before God in song as in life. This is the version of the biblical king which Wyatt, imprisoned in the Tower of London, must give voice to as he translates David's psalms. Thus, David pursues Bathsheba, Henry courts Anne, and Wyatt interweaves the past and present. That sounds really ambitious. Of course, it hits all of Steve's sweet spots. And this is an author who hasn't written a book in a long time. Her last book was a slim little thing called Achilles. That also hit Steve's sweet spots because it was Trojan War fiction that then morphs into romantic poetry fiction in the same 120 pages. This is much bigger, much more ambitious, and this comes out in February. This comes out in 2020. So I won't be reading this year, aside from the segment that we just read. And then the third book is Apartment by Teddy Wayne. Not The Apartment. I wonder how many critics will notice that or point out this author never does anything unintentionally. There's a point to everything he does. This is his new book. This comes out, I think, in 2020. Yeah, this comes out in February. And let's see here. Let me tell you a little bit about this. Let's see. In 1996, another example in the innumerable examples that we have seen of an author in 2019 intentionally setting their book before the era of the internet, before cell phones, before Google, before any of that. Young authors who themselves have never lived without that, intentionally setting their stories in a time that isn't old enough to be historical fiction, but that removes from their narrative burden the weight of the internet and cell phones and constant connectivity. I don't know what I think about that. I've seen it. It's far too widespread. It is definitely a literary fad. Definitely counts as a literary bandwagon. One author after another, after another, after another, after another, writing fiction that is just contemporary enough to take place in our recognizable world, but that is not contemporary enough so that they have to deal with apps and FaceTime. I can't help but view it as a kind of narrative cowardice, even though I find that that's the hardest thing in the world to associate with this author. But anyway, let me tell you about this book. I only got as far as the date before I started perorating. In 1996, the unnamed narrator of Apartment is living in an illegal sublet of a rent-stabilized apartment in Manhattan's Stuyvesant town and attending an MFA college program at Columbia on his father's dime. Feeling lonely and misplaced among his classmates, he finds escape from his lifelong solitude in a surprising friendship with Billy, a talented, charismatic Midwesterner at Columbia on a scholarship. When he offers his spare bedroom rent-free to Billy, the close quarters and power imbalance, not to mention their radically different upbringings, breeds tension neither man could predict. And that is the story of this book. I wonder if this pub sheet tells us any more about it. It is a slyly funny, compassionate, and unsparing in its depiction of two men whose friendship is inexorably altered by the pressures of modern masculinity. But not too modern. Not too modern. Right? 20 years ago. But still. Written through penetrating, nearly claustrophobic gaze of a profoundly isolated individual, this is a novel that brilliantly explores issues of class, talent, and sexuality, exposing how the old systems of gender are toxic to men and women alike. Old systems in 1996. The author is intentionally taking a gigantic step back in order to, at least a little bit, simplify the process of his narrative. But in this case, I'm perfectly willing to grant Teddy Wade the benefit of the doubt, because this is an author who has never displeased me. Never. And I want to mention, let's say, I'll read his biography too. He is the author of Loner, which is terrific. Absolutely terrific. And The Love Song of Johnny Valentine, which is an amazing, amazing book. It is an amazing novel. And also Capitoil, which I thought was a little heavy-handed. I think that might have been his first book. He's the winner of a Winning Writers Award and the NEA Creative Writing Fellowship, as well as a finalist for the Young Lions Fiction Award, the Penn Bingham Prize, and the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. He's a regular contributor to the New Yorker and New York Times, and this book has blurbs from, it has a blurb from the Paris Review about Loner. It has a review by Michiru Kakutani about the Love Song of Johnny Valentine. What does she say? More than a scabrous send-up of American celebrity culture, it's also a poignant portrait of one young artist's coming of age. Typical Kakutani, because it isn't the first part. It isn't a scabrous send-up of American celebrity culture, but that's okay. She probably only read part of the book. And then, of course, what would it be without a blurb from Jonathan Franzen? And what's his blurb? What would a Jonathan Franzen blurb be if it weren't completely obscurantist crap? So what's the blurb from Jonathan Franzen? Capitoil, that was the earliest book, is one of those uncommon novels that really is a novel. Thanks, Jonathan. That's great. Yeah, but this author has an unbelievable amount of positive credit with me. So I am willing to go into our apartment and see whatever he has to do. So that was my page 112 tag. I'll leave a link to Shawn's video. I urge you all to do this. This is so much fun. And also, I mean, it's a lot of fun. But it's also, I think, a great critical exercise. Forces you to really look at a microcosm of prose and look at what's happening that you can judge on that prose, on that single page. I always find that interesting. So whenever Shawn does one, I will do one. And since he's already done one just recently, I may do another one of these on nonfiction. Because I hate that everybody always goes to fiction with these, when nonfiction is just as interesting to read in this context. But this video's gone on long enough. So I'm going to wrap this up, but I will be back. Thank you, BookTube.